metaphors in thought and in language. And today he's going to be giving a talk called Embodied Meaning, Thinking, and Communication. And he's going to talk about conceptual metaphors and embodied experience, which is kind of what I touched on with orientational metaphors the other day. So now we get to go a little bit deeper into how we can use these metaphors and how they apply to our lives.
I've taught Santa Cruz for 33 years. This is the first time I've ever been in this room. This is the first time I've ever used a PowerPoint to teach. So I give plenty of talks professionally in PowerPoint, but I've never actually taught sort of a class using PowerPoint. So this will be different for me. I'm going to tell you about embodied meaning, thinking, and communication. And I have a bunch of stuff I want to tell you. And it's going to kind of go a little fast at times, but again, I'm trying to leave time for questions at the end. But if you have comments or questions at any point, raise your hand, ask it, and I will deal with it, and hopefully that will be useful. So don't keep asking. So I'm a psychologist, and actually I really consider myself to be fundamentally a cognitive scientist. And the primary thing that I study is trying to understand something about how people think by looking at the way that they speak about their lives and their experiences of the world. And I want to give you an example of this by showing you a bit of a conversation between a guy named Howard and his psychotherapist. So this is in the context of a psychotherapy session. And Howard is a 40-year-old man who recently lost his job. He worked at a hospital and he was accused of stealing drugs from the hospital. They fired him. And it turns out also he's having problems with his girlfriend. And so he started to see this therapist. They were trying to talk about his problems in his life. So let's see what it says here. So Judy, who's the therapist, asks him at one point during one of their meetings, she says, when you have a problem, what do you do with it? And then Howard replies, I usually let it be a problem. I don't usually do anything much. Does the problem go away if you don't do anything about it? Howard says, no, it gets worse, or just complicates things as you go further down the road. Can you look at your own life? Look down the road of that line and see what that's going to do in your life. Look down the road. Yeah, kind of visualize what your own life will be like. It will just continue the way it is. Kind of like a snowball effect? No, not a snowball. Just kind of floating down the river. What's it like to be floating down the river? Tell me more. It's comfortable, it's safe. Everything just keeps an even keel, you know. You're just kind of floating. Kind of in a canoe going down the river, or no. More like a great old big barge on a great old big river. Barge. Very stable kind of. Yeah, plenty of room to spread out and sit in the sun. Yeah, and you don't have to worry about falling off the edge. And sun, you know, it's kind of hazy. It's not really clear sun, it's kind of hazy. Kind of half asleep, that's what it's like. Well, what happens when you come to the falls that are down there about 2 miles down the river? Get the hell off the river. Well, that's certainly one way to handle it. Get out. And this is not showing here, but this is, I think that's what was happening last month. I hit those falls last month, and he's referring to when he got fired. The therapist says, well, last time there was kind of an external situation that sort of forced you out of your boat. It was uncomfortable, but I was enjoying it too, and I didn't want to go just back into floating. It was uncomfortable, and I was out. I've been floating a long time. Well, you found what works for you in a sense. What works for me? Floating. Because I'm stay comfortable, and in a sense, but it may now be inappropriate. It may not be working as well as it did in the past. And yes, I need a little excitement now and then. She goes, some rapid, and he goes, yes, I need something that I can be in control of and not drown. Okay, so here's the deal. Howard is talking about his life as if he's experiencing this kind of journey, and he's floating down this river. And so he's talking about his life in a very typical way that many of us do. We talk about our lives as journeys. But he's doing it in a very specific kind of way. It's a way that talks about something that's unique in some respects, because he's on a boat, a barge actually, and it's very stable. And he's lying in the sun, and it's hazy, and he's kind of lazy there. And then he has to worry about what happens down the falls, a little bit down the river. And of course, there's no floating in any barges going on here. And it's very possible that Howard, and even his therapist, Judy, have never been on a barge floating down the river. But what they're doing in the moment is they're creating an imaginative construction of what Howard's life must be like for him at that moment. And it's using metaphor. And it's using metaphor in a way that lots of metaphors are used, namely it relies on very common kinds of bodily experiences, such as the kinds of journeys that we use. And as I've heard, you've learned a little bit about this already, but a lot of the ways that we talk about our lives, and particularly a lot of the ways that we think about our abstract concepts in the world, are very much structured by metaphor that is grounded in embodied experience. And so what I want to do today is I want to drive that point home to you and to try to give you an argument as to why cognitive science most generally has really come around to thinking about the mind not as this kind of abstract computer, but as something that's very much tied to our bodies and our bodies in action. And then if you're going to come up with any kind of theory about how the mind works or how language works, you have to be concerned about the role of embodied experience in that. So, those are some of the comments here. So this is a thing called the life as a journey, as you know, is a kind of conceptual metaphor. It's not a metaphor of language, but it's a metaphor of mind. It's a way in which we think about various kinds of topics, particularly things that are abstract, such as when we're trying to think about and talk about what our lives are like. And there's lots of other kind of evidence, and this is what people in the field of linguistics, particularly the field of cognitive linguistics do, is that they look at the way people talk about their experience, and then they infer the presence of these possible conceptual metaphors. So here are some very conventional expressions that people use to talk about their lives, such as, Sally is off to a good start in her new job. John got seriously sidetracked along the way to finishing her PhD. We overcame several obstacles trying to design the new building. Rick and Jane went their separate ways after their bitter divorce. Right? So these are all understandable. They're very common kinds of expressions. And even though we don't think there's anything particularly creative or particularly poetic about them, they are actually very much tied and motivated by this idea in our minds that life is a kind of journey. And each one of these expressions is motivated by, in fact, comes from this kind of metaphor in our minds. We speak metaphorically in these ways because we think metaphorically. And the reason we do that is that we have to. There's no other choice when you're thinking particularly about abstract kinds of concepts. And the practice of in cognitive linguistics is to do analyses of language like this and then try to infer what are the different conceptual metaphors that indeed we live by. So if you look at language, language is full of metaphor. And we typically, if you go back thousands of years, people used to think that metaphor was this kind of a strange device that we use linguistically to talk about one thing in terms of another. It was thought to be sort of the thing that poets and politicians use. That is, those are both not good things. Because poets try to deceive you and politicians try to deceive you. And so it's bad to use metaphor. A lot of people think metaphors are bad in language. And that they thought that they're not particularly frequent. But in fact, lots of work shows that these are throughout the language. Throughout every language that's been examined, you see it in speech, you see it in writing. It's been there for thousands of years, and every possible kind of data that we have shows that people use metaphor a great deal. And the point of the work on conceptual metaphor is that a lot of people see these kinds of expressions like, oh, I'm off to a good start in college. Well, that's just a dead metaphor. That's cliche. There's nothing interesting there. But in fact, it's still very much an alive metaphor because we think that way. So when we use those kinds of conventional expressions, they're not dead metaphors, despite what your English teachers might tell you. They are, in fact, motivated by the fact that we think in metaphorical ways. And again, we use it particularly to speak of abstract ideas. And many of the so-called source domains that we go, life is a journey, so life is the topic, and journey is the source by which we understand it. Many of those source domains all refer to bodily kinds of experiences. So metaphor isn't this kind of transcendent kind of language, but actually is very much rooted in various kinds of common bodily experiences, such as the taking of journeys. And for this reason, I want to argue here and suggest that metaphor is not deviant. It's not a weird part of language. It's not something that's ornamental. It's not something that just poets use and politicians to be deceptive. But in fact, it's how we all think and speak. And years ago, when I first started work on metaphor back in graduate school, I studied how difficult it was for people to understand these. And I did all sorts of psychological experiments over many years to show that, in fact, in many cases, people understand these very easily. It doesn't require additional processing to understand what they mean because we are actually thinking metaphorically in the first place. Now, this all goes against the kind of a traditional view of mind. This is actually the view that I was taught when I was in college and graduate school. The mind is literal. Literal thoughts. Our thoughts are literal. And metaphor is just an instance of language to talk about some of those literal thoughts. The thoughts that we have in our minds are disembodied in the sense that maybe some of them are related to experience, but ultimately what is in our minds, cognitively, are disembodied. They're detached from the kinds of experiences that we have in everyday life. They're also thought to be understood and processed through abstract computational terms, which is why one of the prevalent metaphors that defines cognitive science historically is we try to think of the mind as being like a computer. Back in the 1950s, when computers were becoming more common and we're getting more knowledge about how computers work and we're developing computer machinery, we started thinking, okay, what ways are minds like computers? And that has been enormously influential in the rise of psychology and cognitive science. But it may not be the only way to think about how minds work. Because, again, it thinks of the mind as this abstract little machine in your head, divorced from the body. This is Rodin's The Thinker, one of the versions of it, and this is often used to reflect what people think cognition is all about, where the body is still and the person's just thinking, and you kind of feel like all the cognition is up here, right up here, this up here, from the eyebrows up. That's all we're interested in, because that's where it's all happening. And so you know the body's not doing anything, and you're thinking, you're doing these little computations up there. That's what we typically think, historically, how the minds work. But I want to suggest to you that the minds work this way. This is a gentleman who's participating in the United States air guitar competition. Have you ever done air guitar, right? So what he's doing is he's listening to music, and he's acting as if he is performing the music himself. And in other words, he's imitating, or what I like to refer to as that he's simulating this event, as if he's engaged in this very process of making the music. And notice how fully embodied it is. He isn't just kind of like playing da-da-da-da. He's putting himself entirely into it in a bodily kind of manner. I want to suggest to you this is how people work, and this is how our minds work. What we do when we think, and when we use language, is we project ourselves into the thing that we're encountering in the world. And we imagine ourselves actually engaging in those activities. Howard and Judy, when they're talking about his life, and he's describing it as floating down a river in a great old big barge, they're actually imagining themselves engaged in that action. They're simulating what that must be like. And that actually motivates why Howard talks in specific ways he does, and also his conversant, his partner, Judy, is understanding it by imagining what it must be like to engage in those very actions. Even if it's physically impossible for one to do, we still do this. And this motivates a great deal of the ways that we think and understand the world. So in this regard, I ultimately want to argue here that human language and thought of many sorts is fundamentally metaphorical. Metaphor is not, again, this ornamental, deviant thing. It's a fundamental part of how we think, but especially in regard to abstract kinds of concepts. Our concepts and our language are fundamentally embodied. I say a lot more about this, but our experience of what is meaningful in the world as we walk around, why things make sense to us, is because we are engaged in these imaginative simulations of what something must be like. Now, when we talk about embodiment, and I'm just going to give you a brief spiel on this, because there's lots of debates these days to say, well, the mind is embodied. What does that mean? What do you mean by the body? And there are certain people who argue that, well, everything that's embodied has to do with the brain, and so you can understand everything there is to know about how people work by studying the brain. And many neuroscientists have maintained this point of view. Other people more traditionally said, well, it's in the cognitive unconscious. That is to say, the ways in which we think, reason, remember, solve problems, make decisions, how we perceive, how we use language, all of these things happen quickly, automatically. We don't have to think about how to understand language, we just do it. We don't have to think about how the problems we solve are done, we just do it. It happens quickly, unconsciously. And that's where we think embodiment might be. And other people think it's, well, the most important level of embodiment is our phenomenological experience of what it feels to us consciously. And I want to argue that all of these levels are relevant. And in fact, they all interact with each other in complex kinds of ways. So I have a very broad, loose, promiscuous definition of what embodiment is. I think it is an interaction of the brains and the body interacting with the world. Sometimes we're not aware of it, such as things in our nerve. I mean, I can't introspect about what's going on in my brain right now. I can't tell you what's going on in my left hemisphere. Sorry, I can't do it. Neither can any of you. But there's things that I do have awareness of. I know what it feels like for my body to move about into the world. And that phenomenological awareness is relevant to our understanding of embodiment. So it's all of these things interacting is where I think embodiment can be best understood. So the embodied simulation hypothesis that I specifically want to argue again is that people make sense of the experience by imagining themselves performing the actions they encounter. This is how we get around to the world. We imagine ourselves doing things with our bodies. And I'm going to try and make this argument in terms of some research that's been happening in perception, thinking, and language. And this is where things get a little quick in terms of the studies, but first let me show you this. This is a flyer that I found on a bulletin board in Santa Cruz about 10 years ago. And here it is, you can see these are shoes. These are the kinds of shoes that students at UC Santa Cruz wear quite often. I have to tell this to people when I go around the world. They go, what are those? What is that? Those are shoes that students sometimes wear. And it says here, you have feet, use them to stomp out racism in your scene, and it invites you to attend a meeting at a particular place. So let's consider the phrase, use them to stomp out racism. Now racism is this abstract kind of thing. How do you stomp out something that's abstract? What does it mean to stomp out racism? Well, what we're doing here is we're understanding this in an embodied metaphorical way, where we think of racism metaphorically as some kind of object, or maybe even some kind of animal or organism that is a negative, harmful kind of thing, and that we therefore need to eradicate it. And the way that we can eradicate it, when we're thinking of it as this kind of object or this organism, is to do some physical action upon it to make it disappear, such as stomping it out with your feet. And again, the humor, if you talk to humors, is the fact that you can use your shoes, so to speak, that you typically wear to stomp out kinds of racism. So, did you all understand what that meant, stomp out racism, the general metaphorical idea? The suggestion then is that you're understanding it by imagining what it would be like to actually engage in physical action against this abstract but now metaphorical concept. When it's metaphorical, you make it concrete. And when you think of it as an object or as a thing that, a little bug or an organism that you can stamp out and eradicate and kill, it makes sense. It makes sense to you. So, the question then is, why are people able to imaginally project themselves into the actions referred to in language? Why are people able to actually say, oh, I know what it feels like to stomp out racism, even if you've never actually engaged in that action before in the past? How can you do that? So I'm going to tell you now of some evidence related to the cognitive science of embodied experiences. And so basically I'm trying to do two things here. One is I want to just give you some brief examples of how research shows that the mind is embodied, and how we think and perceive and embody in kinds of ways. But then I also want to use some of this evidence to, again, build this case to suggest to you that our experiences of meaning are indeed, again, very much a matter of us projecting ourselves in an embodied way into the things that we are encountering. So let's start with perception. Here's a chair. Now here's a question that thousands of people over many centuries have studied. How is it that you are able to perceive that object? How is it that you're able to perceive and recognize what that is? And I suggest here that a very typical traditional kinds of theories would say, well, what you do is you visually process the stimulus in some way, and you parse the object, and you take this and you match it against some representation of what a chair is like in your brain. And you do some matching, feature matching between the thing in the world and the thing in your head, and you come up with a description like, oh, aha, that's a chair. Now, you don't necessarily do that consciously. You do it very quickly, of course. But you do it in a very kind of static way, particularly since the chair is just sort of sitting there. But I want to suggest that the perception of the chair is centered around the bodily activities that the chair itself performs. Let me see if I can go back up to this. Yes. So, this is based on some work, in particular the psychologist James Gibson, many decades ago, talked about, you perceive this in the way that all animals perceive things in the world. You understand it in terms of what you can do with it, with your body. So what are the things that you can do with that chair as you sort of sit and stand and look at it? Well, I might be able to imagine myself moving my body and positioning it and sitting on it. Some chairs, I'm able to do that. I'm a big person. I may not be able to do it in that particular chair as well as some of you can. I may be able to stand on the chair. I may be able to stack the chair with other kinds of chairs and to build a little pyramid of chairs. I may be able to turn it upside down to do something. I may be able to pick it up and use it to ward off the snarling lion that just entered the classroom. I can do all of these things with it. And the idea that what perception is that when you see an object and you make sense of it, what you're doing is imagining the things you can do with your body to that object. What are the things you can do? What are the things that you can't do? In the animal world, you do it very simplistically in terms of, is this something that's positive or negative in my life? Is it something that's going to kill me? Is it something that I can eat, walk on, stand on? And this, so in other words, this is very related to animal kinds of perception. So I want to suggest that we do this thing by imagining ourselves engaging in various possible actions onto that object. So perception is anticipated bodily actions that can and cannot be made in a particular moment in time. This is George Bush, lovely guy. And so here's the question here. You're watching George Bush, this is I think during some debate or some town hall meeting he had with people, and the camera caught him at a perfect moment where he's scratching his head and confused. So how do you understand this image? How do you understand this if you were watching George Bush in the moment? And notice here that he's scratching his head, and that could mean many things. It could mean things like, well, he's got an itch in his head, or he's like, I don't know what the fuck you're saying. What? Huh? It's kind of George Bush-like. And so, some of the work, and this is really an exciting but still somewhat controversial set of findings, is that we are able to perceive this by imagining ourselves doing the action that he's doing. So we place ourselves in his shoes as if he is doing that thing, and that's how we perceive it. And the work that best exemplifies this idea comes from the study of what are called mirror neurons. And the mirror neuron system is something where a mirror neuron is a neuron in your brain, particularly in the inferior frontal cortex and superior parietal lobe. It's a particular part of your brain related to your motor cortex. And it's a neuron that fires both when an animal acts, such as when George Bush is, scratching his head. There's some part of his brain that enables him to make the movement of scratching his head. But it also is activated when an animal observes the same action performed by another. So you are watching it, and you too are as if you are almost doing the very action that he is performing. So the neuron mirrors the behavior of the others as though the observer were itself acting. And here's how this actually came about. This was done by some Italian cognitive neuroscientists who discovered this completely by accident. They were working with not chimps, these are, the pictures here are chimps, but they were working with macaque monkeys. And they were measuring their brain stuff and their motor cortex while they were doing various kinds of actions. But they noticed that when the monkey was watching another monkey do something, like grab a banana, there was neural activity in their own motor cortex, as if they were doing that kind of action. And they go, what's this? Why should the animal motor cortex be active as if it's doing an action when it's doing nothing? It's just observing. And this is the beginning of the mirror neuron system. Oh, that's just something that it's a regular kind of relationship. So the same place in your brain gets active both when you do the action as well as you see someone doing the action. Yes, please.
And this is why, like, when like you see like extreme sports or whatever, you kind of like cringe or like.
Yes. Actually, that's exactly right. And so this is why this is relevant, and this is why this is such an important finding in many people. It's how you can make sense and have empathy for other people. You know, why is it that you can take another person's perspective and understand where they're coming from? And typically in philosophy and psychology in particular, there's lots of debates that you have to come up with a theory of what's in the other person's mind, what they must be thinking. But the work of mirror neurons suggests that in fact, it's simpler than that. You're actually understanding the other person's perspective by projecting yourself into what they are doing. And you do this automatically. So as if you yourself are doing the action to some degree. Yes?
Is this how like children learn?
It's going to be an important part of how children learn. And again, part of the issue in terms of development of empathy in kids is the build-up of this mirror neuron system. And in fact, one of the most interesting and, again, controversial hypotheses is that individuals, starting with children who suffer different kinds of, or on the autistic spectrum disorders, part of the reason they have autism is because their mirror neuron system is dysfunctional. They're not able to it's not working, so they can't put themselves into the perception of another person. They can't do that kind of embodied simulation. Yes?
What happens like when it's two people watch like the same crazy like thing happen and one person like feels like more freaked out by it than the other person? Is that because they're now under?
I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the fact that the mirror neuron system is different, but it's because what they do with that and how they, and this is a course I teach in psychology of emotions, how they appraise the event makes a difference. So one person may somehow see an event and imagine themselves doing it and be scared by that possibility. Other people may be thrilled by it. So for example, we were talking about the question of what happens when you see someone get injured and you cringe, or you see extreme sports and they do something crazy. I, for example, has anybody here gone bungee jumping? I think that is the smartest, craziest idea ever in the history of mankind. And the reason why it's crazy is because I run the simulation. And I go, I ain't jumping out of that bridge or that plane. I just can't do it. But still, all of us are running a simulation of sorts, but how we react to that simulation is where you're going to find different kinds of emotional reactions. Yes?
Can you control it?
Well, you can't control the mirror neuron system by itself. No. But you can
How
certainly...
you react to
Oh,
it?
absolutely. You can learn to appraise it something different. And, again, this is a part of this course that I teach on cognitive appraisals. Here's my example. I'm driving home down Highway 1 at the end of a long day at the university, and it's crowded, and someone cuts me off on the highway. And I get pissed off. How dare that son of a bitch cut in front of me. I'm going to kill him, oh God. So I'm really angry. I'm very upset. But then, what I can do is I go, think about the situation differently. I can think about the fact that that person must have had a poor childhood. Or they must have had an even worse day than I did. Or they have to go home and there's no beer in the refrigerator. Mine is full of beer. And I start thinking of that, and by rethinking the situation, by reappraising it, I actually feel differently.
Yeah.
So the rule is, if you want to feel differently, think differently about what's happening. But in terms of the mirror neuron system, this is all happening quite automatically. Please.
So I think it was Bertrand Russell who brought up the problem of other minds.
Yes.
And
Well, several people have, but
yeah,
Russell did it
but
too.
he in particular solved it by saying that like, it's kind of the same concept of if I think like, for example, if I'm thirsty and you're thirsty, I can prove that you have a mind because you're thirsty also. I can't exactly remember how it goes particularly, but do you think that the whole mirror neuron thing supports that?
Yes.
Or, okay.
Absolutely. The ability that you have to run that kind of little thought experiment
Yeah.
is based on the mirror neuron system, particularly when you're looking at actions or things that you hear people say.
But even with that appraisal concept, because doesn't that appraisal concept like really take away from other, you know, like if someone appraises something very differently than I do, then how can it, does it really?
Well, here's the thing. The mirror neuron system provides the basic input
Yeah.
to what are might be these kind of slightly slower but still reasonably fast-acting appraisal processes. So the differences, again, are not going to lie necessarily in the mirror neuron system, but are going to lie at higher levels of cognition, such as how you appraise and how you think it.
So you can still, okay.
Yeah, so we can have an argument, and there are times where I just simply don't understand what you're saying. But there's other times where I do understand what you're saying, I understand where you're coming from, but I still will disagree with you. Right? So it's a different, slightly different kind of process.
Going off of that, can't this be a bad thing? Because you're imagining yourself in someone's situation, but your reaction is different. So you have a misunderstanding of how they feel because you don't agree.
Well, yes, but indeed the fact of the matter is that the mirror neuron system gives you enough information such to a significant degree you do make sense of what people are doing. Right? So, you know, you see someone walk standing in front of a door and they're playing with their keys and your phone and you go, what is that person doing? What is their intentions in that particular situation? And then you can kind of run a simulation. Oh, I know what that is like. I can feel what that's like, and I can understand that they have a particular intention.
So it is empathy. Like,
Well, in this case, I think this is the root of it. This is at least part of the neural basis of where empathy arises. Yes?
So does the mirror neuron, like this whole system, work just with other humans or any organism with neurons?
No. It certainly works with higher non-human primates.
Okay.
Not any organism. There might be limits. I don't think they've tried to look at it I'm trying to figure out what level of species they've gone to try to see this, but let's for the moment just say
But
higher.
nothing surprising
No.
as far as that? Okay.
No. But, when one cat sees another cat do something and makes sense of what that cat is doing, that might be still do some level like, I know what that's like.
Right, but we just can't understand that.
Well, we may, we have some understanding of it. We do a lot of anthropomorphizing. Well, the cat wants this and the cat wants that, but we can't really get entirely into the kind of mind and experience of the cat, partly because we have different bodies. Not just sort of different brains, but our bodies are different. Please.
What about like limited experience when you're watching another human performing something and you've literally never seen that?
Yes.
How can you run that simulation in your head?
This is a good one. That's a very good question. In fact, I'm going to argue that we can do that. We do that. And we can often do it in cases where things are fantastical, which is why you can, for example, watch movies that are crazy and bizarre, and science fiction. You can read and understand things that you yourself can't do in the world. You may sometimes have difficulty understanding. But still, we do have the ability to project ourselves out of our own experiences to some slight degree. So I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But let me just say a few other things that in terms of the evidence here. When people listen to music, their motor cortex is active as if, in fact, they're performing the music in some way. When you speak and you listen to somebody, when you hear someone say something like, I kicked the table, there's a sense of kicking motion active in your motor cortex and your mirror neuron system. And I want to quickly give you an example of this in terms of art perception, because I think this is kind of cool work. Here's a portion of your brain called the somatosensory cortex. It is a portion of the brain that registers various kinds of sensory things from the body. This is a cartoon diagram of all the things that are along that cortex. So we see there's a lot of cortex related to lips and feeling of things. And so here's the thing that they found. And you can measure this through brain scanning, so exactly what portions of the sensory cortex are activated when people see various things. And it turns out this is relevant in art perception. So this is a picture or slide of Michelangelo's Expulsion from Paradise. And what they find is that when people are looking at the actions of the arm going out like this, or the sword going like this, people are not just looking at that passively, there's an arm. to actually activate activations in their motor cortex, the somatosensory cortex, as if they are doing that action. So that's how you perceive and relate to artworks. You're not just sort of looking statically, you're imaginatively projecting yourself into the artwork that has some bodily kinds of actions. But even when there's no bodily actions that are overt, there's been some work looking at how people perceive this particular abstract painting. And what they find is that people are perceiving these slashes as if they are themselves making these movements. It implies a kind of slashing, it implies a kind of movement, even though there's no physical body there. And they find that people see it and perceive it in part through activation of somatosensory cortex related to hand movements. So even when you're looking at artworks, you're projecting your body into that in some way, and that's how you make sense of that experience. Mental imagery. Yes, please.
Have they done anything like with the painting you said that someone would imagine themselves slashing with a sword? Have they ever studied like when you see someone doing something to someone else, which person you'd be more likely to imagine yourself? Like would you choose the one that you
That's a great question. And these are called, actually this is a really big topic that is beginning to be studied but needs to be studied some more. So what perspective are you taking when you watch a scene?
slash with a slasher?
In this case, because the range of actions that people specified are limited. But what happens when you're seeing a complex scene with lots of people doing various kinds of actions? What perspective are you taking in all of that? Similarly, when you're reading a novel, for example, and you're taking primarily the perspective of a narrator, are you simulating from the narrator's point of view? Are you simulating from some of the other characters' point of view? We're just beginning to study those kinds of perspective effects, but it's a great question to ask. Yes?
So, do you think that it has anything to do with a person's personal experience, like perhaps if a felon who's in jail for like stabbing somebody might perceive themselves as the stabber instead of the victim?
Yeah. There's been suggestions, actually, Pat Churchill was a philosopher I heard once screaming, we need to run prisoners in fMRI experiments to see what the mirror neuron system is doing, precisely to answer questions like that. We certainly know from, I'm sorry, what?
Is that legal?
You gotta do these things right. You have to get human subjects' consent and so
They have to
forth.
volunteer.
Yeah, you have to volunteer. But I thought that was a rather cynical kind of experiment, but it would still be interesting to do. We do know from other kinds of studies that people who have violent personal histories, they react very, very quickly to certain kinds of stimulus, such as words relating to violence. Show a picture of a knife, they respond to it in a particular way. So there's some very fast cognitive processing going on that directs their attention very immediately, directly towards certain kinds of stimuli. We know that, but it hasn't been put together with the mirror neuron research as far as I know. Yes.
Mirror syndrome, how people who suffer from that kind of take on personality so that
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say that it explains one thing which is interesting in the literature, this phenomenon of emotional contagion. So you're around somebody who's happy, and all of a sudden you're like happy. Have you ever gone into a room and a bunch of people are laughing, and like a few seconds later, you're laughing too? What happened there? You don't even know what they're laughing about. But just seeing them laughing gets you laughing. And the downside, seeing people who are visibly and bodily depressed can make you depressed. Absolutely. So there is some of that. Usually though, but notice one key thing about the mirror neuron system is that it's structured in a way so that most of the time when we see George Bush scratching his head, we don't all understand it by scratching our heads. Right? We can run a simulation without having to actually enact the thing entirely with our entire bodies. There are people who have various other kinds of neurological disorders where they can't help but kind of mirror and imitate other people. And that's actually seen as that's a serious behavioral and brain deficit. But there are some people who have that issue. It's almost as if they can't inhibit the full firing of the mirror neuron system. They almost have to do the thing entirely. Yes?
Yeah, a few slides ago you had music perception up
Yes.
there. I'm curious what that has to do with embodied cognition. Like if I see someone playing guitar, that's completely different than if I hear Beethoven 6.
No, but when you hear Beethoven 6, the argument is that you're partly imagining yourself producing the notes in some way, as if you were doing it. Now, it may not, suppose you're hearing a bassoon song. You're not really bassoon. But you do have a sense of like, voice and movement and up and down and keys and tones, and you can kind of like imagine yourself doing it very subconsciously, but the mirror neuron research says that you're doing something like that, even for things that you can't physically yourself do. You can't play the bassoon, but you can still imagine yourself in some crude way, as if you were. And that's in part how you understand what the music is all about. And also how you do things like, in music, say classical music, how you can get this sense of emotion, mood, things building up. It's building up because you're doing it. You're right there. You're feeling it. That's where the feeling comes from, in part, from the mirror neuron kind of stuff.
Kind of in the context of like that picture with like two people doing an action. It might not be, you imagine yourself to be one person or the other person, but you kind of have a general sense of the relationship between the two people.
Yeah, this is
and
again.
It's not a total like your mind goes into their mind or something.
Well, it isn't your mind going into your mind. You understand them by becoming them.
Yeah.
Not mind versus mind, but becoming them in some general embodied way. But again, these are perspective effect issues that people are looking at in certain ways. Yes, please.
I was just wondering, how you see someone yawn and then right afterwards you yawn? Is that because of the...
That's partly, yeah. Absolutely.
What makes us do that? Because that's...
The mirror neuron system is partly responsible for that? Yes.
But how do we... Because obviously we don't really do everything that the other person is doing, but yawning seems to be an exception to that.
The laughing,
Oh, yeah.
smiling.
Yeah.
There's lots of emotional things in particular have these kinds of contagious effects. Yes, there's individual differences, there's context that matters, but still there are these general tendencies that we have that suggest that, again, even when we're perceiving or imagining ourselves doing this very thing. Let me skip through the mental imagery stuff because it's a little more complicated. Let me talk about problem solving. This is a very clear example. How much money is there? How much? 66 cents? You're like, 66 cents? Here's the study. You present people a bunch of coins like this, and then you say, how much money is there? And the people go like, 66 cents. If you allow them to be able to touch and put their fingers on the coins, they can make the calculation faster and they're more accurate. So why is it that touching the things makes you better able to do the problem solving? And the reason, in fact, the argument is, in fact, that when you touch something, you're extending your cognitive problem-solving abilities out via the body into the world, so that you don't have to do as much internally with your own mind. Let me give you another example. This is a classic one. Can you divide the number 13,095 by 45? No? Not at all. Without taking out your calculators or whatever, your iPads, can you do it? You remember how to do long division? Yes. Ah, okay. So if you took a piece of paper and did it, you might do something like this. Right? You do something like this, right? You remember, you taught this? Yeah. When I was a student, you taught how to do these kind of things. So here's the question. This is a question about how you conceive of where the mind is. The argument here is the fact that you do this, you put things out on paper. Where is the mind when you're solving and doing the long division? Is it in your head? Is it in your pencil? Is it on the paper? Well, what we're engaging with and we're doing here is something that we do throughout our lives all the time. And that is something which is called your cognitive offloading. Offloading our cognition through the body out into the world. And so, what this suggests is that the mind is not inside your head. It's not even just simply your mind in your body, your brain in your body, but it's your brain, your body, and your world of interaction. So the mind is what we describe in cognitive science is extended or distributed. This is the extended mind hypothesis, which many philosophers have had a great time trying to argue in favor of and against. So some people love this idea, some people hate it. Your mind, again, isn't just this thing inside your brain or here. It's extended through the body out into the world. And this is what we do ordinarily all the time in our experience. We offload. We cognitively offload. I dare say that many of you, if you opened up your backpacks and stuff, you have all sorts of devices where you don't have to remember stuff. You don't have to think about stuff. You have alarm clocks and all sorts of devices to help you remember things and do things. We do that so that we can be dumb. So we don't have to be so smart. And by not having to be so smart, by putting things, by offloading our cognition into the body and out into the world and back, we presumably can be freed up to be creative about other things. And that's something that we all, this is a basic, fundamental, evolutionary impulse of cognitively offload. And the fact that we do that as we do, by touching the coins, by doing the long division, not by grabbing a piece of paper with a pencil, is we're cognitively offloading. And the whole world of technology is the world of how to best offload things from our minds. So that's something to think about as we consider where the mind is and embodiment. The body is out, it's extended out into the world and back. Memory. Can you recall a time, just simply, where you're in a dentist's office? Just think about a time you're in a dentist's office. Can you recall that? You got a memory there? Has everybody got a kind of memory there? Well, here's the experiment. If you ask people to do this in one of two ways. One is that they're lying down on a couch, or they're standing with their hands in their hips. Guess which one provokes or facilitates the recall of being at a dentist better? Lying on the couch, right? The reason is because the memory itself is not just encoded abstractly in your mind. It isn't just a little neural network in your brain. It's something that's very much tied to your body experience. Your body is encoded as part of the memory. So your autobiographical memory is itself inherently embodied. And this is something a lot of people show you. Memory or problem solving is very embodied. These things are not just computations in our head. These are bodily based kinds of activities.
Right.
Yes?
Couldn't you argue, though, that it's not so much that it's more that you're not, or it's not that it's a neural network, so to speak, but it's more like that you've already primed the motor neurons that are going to be activated anyway by you thinking of that experience.
Well, but when you think of the dentist's office, there's a lot of things that you can think of and be in the dentist's office, but this primary embodied thing, because you don't lie on a couch when you go to the dentist's office. You're in a dentist's chair, right?
Yeah.
So there's the positioning of the body facilitates your recovering of that particular memory. I can have you, here's another experiment. We'll get this related to something I'll talk about in a minute. Emotions. If I put your body in certain kinds of positions, like this, and I put you in this position, I don't tell you to feel anything, and you sit there for a minute, guess what will happen to you? You begin to get sad. And the study shows you get people like this, and they kind of clench, and they're kind of like this. They begin to get angry. You get people to stand up straight, smile, put their chest out. They feel pride. And so you're not telling them to think about any particular emotion. Simply putting the body in certain kinds of postures is evocative of various kinds of meaningful experiences. The method of loci, this is an embodied memory phenomena. Ancient Greek and Latin orators used to remember these very, very, very long speeches they had to give by using this very trick of memory where they had a speech and then they would put parts of it as down. Imagine themselves walking down a road that they're familiar with, and they would put bits of information from the speech at different kinds of places. And then later on, when they had to give the speech, they just reenacted the embodied experience of walking down this road, and they go and they pick up certain kinds of information. So they place it out into the world of their imagination, but again, it's kind of an offload. To put it in a concrete bodily form helps you remember certain kinds of things. Let me stop. Let me go. Let's get into what time is it, first of all? I know You guys take a break. Okay. Let's take a break. I don't know how long you take a break. We'll come back and finish it up. All right, so we're talking about embodiment and how we sometimes imaginatively project ourselves via our bodies into the minds of others. To what extent that is language itself an embodied kind of activity? Here's a study. The study is the following. I ask you to either go like this, make a pinch. Can you all make a pinch? Now make a fist. So in this particular experiment, you're asked to do one of these two things with this particular file, a pinch or a fist. And then you're presented with a three-letter word string, excuse me, a three-word string. And you have to make a judgment, does that make sense or not? And you're supposed to do that as quickly as possible, yes or no. And it turns out that when you do a pinch first, like this, you just make this little bodily action, you're faster to understand this than if you don't make that bodily action. On the other hand, if you make a fist and then throw a punch, you're faster to understand that than if you don't make that kind of bodily action. And moreover, if you do a fist and presented with aim or dart, you slow down in making that judgment. And if you do a pinch gesture and then presented with throw a punch, you are slowing down. So something about your bodily actions have some influence upon the speed with which you make sensibility judgments about the meaning of language. And this is a simple kind of experimental finding that leads some people to suggest, maybe our understanding of language isn't just simply this purely linguistic thing, or just a purely cognitive kind of thing. It actually recruits various kinds of bodily actions, which is consistent with the idea that I've suggested, namely that when you understand throw a punch, guess what you imagine doing? Throwing a punch. You almost imagine as if you are doing that very kind of action. So doing the actual gesture makes that even faster to be able to understand phrases like that. Here's another one. This is actually some cognitive neuroscience. Compare the two expressions, Sam had a bad day, Sam had a rough day. They're both suggestive of Sam's day wasn't so good. However, Sam had a rough day is actually a metaphorical expression. It's a very conventionalized metaphor. So rough, what does it mean? Why, when you say rough, why is a day rough? Rough is a sensory quality, as if you're running your fingers along the surface of something that feels rough as opposed to smooth. Now, again, most people think that, well, you don't really do anything particularly embodied when you understand language, particularly for very conventional metaphors like Sam had a rough day. But cognitive neuroscience research suggests something differently. So again, this is in brain imaging studies to see what areas of your somatosensory cortex are activated when you read and understand various kinds of phrases. So in particular, let's say right around here, around the place where your fingers feel things, it turns out that there's action, there's activity in this area, specifically when you hear Sam had a rough day, but not Sam had a bad day. It seems as if you embody even this simple metaphorical term. It doesn't really mean Sam had a day where he was running his fingers along stuff, but your understanding of that still is this thing as if you are engaged in some sensory action, as if you are feeling the roughness. And that feeling of the roughness helps you understand its metaphorical kind of meaning.
I was reading this one, anyways, basically there's this model of the mind talking about competing thoughts, and it's a possibility that there's it's like, oh, does it mean literal rough? Or no, it's a very metaphorical rough.
Yeah, that's a great, this is something which I've, at very issues, I've studied for 35 years. Can you imagine? I want to suggest that it depends, I'd be careful by the word literal. What I want to suggest is that what is going on, it's not a competition. Because indeed, in this case, the literal sense of roughness, or the physical sense of roughness, actually motivates the metaphorical meaning. They're not in competition with one another. The embodied experience helps you understand why the roughness means what it does, meaning it's not a particularly good, easy, flowing kind of day, because you've had to experience it in a rough manner. So they're not competing. The embodied experience is and the embodied meaning is feeding into the metaphorical meaning. So the metaphorical meaning is ultimately not this abstract thing, it's embodied. That's what you're processing.
Is this especially true for people who are, say, blind? Because they're used to using their body more, and like maybe they don't feel like they're computing in their head, and that they're actually using their entire body.
You know, that's a very good question. The simple answer, which is not very interesting perhaps, is that everybody does this. It isn't that blind people have a very particularly highly enhanced sense of running these kinds of simulations because they don't have vision. So I'm not sure more what you were trying to imply by that.
I only say that because, like, okay, because I can see, I kind of feel like I am contained in my head.
Yes.
Like, that I'm repeating everything in my head. So it makes sense to go with, like, the brain is what's, is disembodied,
Yes.
a disembodied experience. But when you don't have sight or anything, maybe you feel like more spread out, like you are using your entire body to protect.
Not necessarily. I mean, blind people still have this, they get influenced by cultural conceptions just like you. They still have a sense of their mind. If I say, point to your mind, most of you kind of go up here, right? Most of you go up here, you think it's related to your brain. I mean, blind people do exactly that as well. So they still have a sense of the mind as a container, physically, that contains the brain, but also the mind, more abstractly, is a container that you put stuff in. And sometimes things have to fall out, or you forget things, or you learn things. Sometimes things have to be reorganized. Blind people have the exact same kinds of conceptions as do sighted people in those fundamental ways. There are differences between people who are blind and people who are sighted. It depends when they became blind and so forth. There are some differences, but most generally, we find these kinds of effects very rarely in people who are sighted, as well as people who are blind. They have studied that with looking at blind, they find these similar kinds of effects. The idea, again, is that metaphor itself activates relevant brain areas for bodily actions and experience, which is how you understand it. You imagine yourself doing and engaging in the sensory bodily actions. So here's a bunch of work that this is, again, something I've spent a lot of time working on. And I guess I'm not going to try and go into great detail about these studies. I have one that I was going to go into detail, but I'm going to skip it. But here's the gist. The idea, again, is that when you're understanding these kinds of metaphorical expressions, you imagine yourself participating in the very actions related to them. So if I said John hungered for fame, that makes sense to you? You have a thirst for knowledge. The idea is that when you are hearing this, or even when you're producing it, there's some simulation of your bodily sense of feeling hunger or thirst that's related to this. Now again, fame isn't something you can literally eat, but still, there's some activation or relevance of the experience of hunger that motivates why you use the word hunger to talk about things that you desire, which are abstract. It's part of your experience, and you imagine that as you hear and produce expressions like this. Peter could not grasp the concept of infinity. Now, the last time I knew, the concept of infinity is pretty abstract. I don't know what's there to grasp. So why do we use the word grasp in this context? Well, it turns out that from our experiences of going around in the world, the things that we can actually grab onto and pull into our possession are the things that we're most able to know. Because we can examine them and look at them by using bodily kinds of actions. Things that we are unable to grasp onto, such as ideas that are over our head, are things we're not able to know as particularly well. So even though the concept of infinity, or just even the notion of grasping a concept, is an abstract thing, and you would think you don't want to have to do anything, you want to get away from the grasping to recognize that the person here saying Peter could not understand the concept of infinity. According to the simulation idea, you are imagining yourself literally, physically grasping something, which is a metaphorical object, meaning a concept. And once you understood, once you grabbed onto it, pulled it to the body, and you examine it, you can come to know it, and you can come to understand it. I've done some research. There's a very simple kind of experiments where I had people engage in various kinds of bodily actions, such as I say, do this action, and then we do an action like this. I prime them to do an action like this, grasping motion. When you have them do that action, it facilitated, it speeded up the time it took them to understand expressions like this, compared to when they did no action whatsoever. And this is very odd to people who study metaphor, because you think to get at the metaphorical meaning, you want to get beyond the physicality. If you're having people doing movements, that's going to distract them away from the metaphorical meaning. But in fact, it's exactly the opposite. Doing the embodied action is useful and facilitates your understanding of something like Peter couldn't grasp the concept, because it helps you construct a more elaborate embodied kind of simulation. Question, please.
So do you think children should be taught with the bodily?
You betcha. Absolutely. I mean, that's the biggest thing. You know, counting. You're not supposed to touch your fingers when you're counting. I don't know if that's what they used to tell us. Don't count. No, that helps. Using the body.
Montessori schooling is based on that.
Yes. Actually, there's a lot of educational programs that are based on looking for some of the sensory motor foundations of learning. But absolutely. I mean, there's plenty of studies now that show that having people engage in full body movements helps them understand physics concepts, math concepts. You know, feeling it with the body helps you understand what the larger abstract principle is. Please.
How did you measure their understanding?
Okay, so this is a simple experiment where people would do a grasping motion, or they would do some other motion like picking something up. Future screen grasps the concept, and they had to push a button as soon as possible, indicating when they've understood it. So it's very quick. But again, having to do a relevant action speeds up the time at which they can read it and understand it, compared to cases where they're doing no action, or when they're doing an action that's different. Another thing which is interesting here is you just sort of give them a cue to imagine yourself grasping. You don't even have to do the action, just imagine yourself doing the action of grasping. That action also facilitates the same, you also get the same pattern of results. So simply imagining grasping will help you construct an embodied simulation that will be able to understand what these things metaphorically mean. My marriage is moving along in a good direction. Has anybody been married here or ever been in a relationship that was moving along in a good direction? I have. Have you ever been in a relationship that was like going nowhere? Spinning, yeah, I have. Spinning your wheels. We have to go our separate ways. We can't turn back now. We're stuck. We're running around. We think of relationships as many things in terms of these embodied metaphors of life as a journey, or relationships as a kind of journey. And I'm interested here, and the question is, when you hear something like my marriage is moving along in a good direction, what does that mean? Well, it means it's good, right? And it's like there's some potential for future goodness. Now, under the embodied simulation idea, you don't just understand and say, oh yeah, there's something good going on here. You imagine the movement of the relationship. You imagine the movement going, and if it's good, the speed of this movement and the distance that you travel is going to be greater than if it's not moving in a good direction, or if you've encountered some obstacles along the way. And I've done some experiments, which again I'm not going to try and go into detail about, where I have people listen to stories which end with like my marriage is moving, has the expression my marriage is moving along in a good direction as part of it. And in some cases the relationship actually continues to be successful. In another context it continues to be, it starts to become unsuccessful. And then after they hear this kind of stories, I actually did this experiment when I had them walk out to this tennis ball while they're blind. And I just wanted to see, does it, hearing these sentences in different contexts change how they walk after hearing these stories? And I found that when they see my marriage is moving along in a good direction, and when they hear it in a successful context, they walk further and they walk faster. When they hear it in a context where the relationship ultimately wasn't so good, they don't walk as far. So it's a sense as if your understanding of this metaphor in context, you're imagining what it must be like to conceive of the marriage as something that's an entity that moves along in some particular kind of direction. It has a feel to it. This is the other thing I like about the embodied simulation ideas. It has feelings of how it explains why we have feelings when we understand and use language, even abstract language using metaphor. It has bodily sensations to it. And so again, we imagine yourself engaging in the action that we're hearing. So there's lots of evidence in psycholinguistics about this, and I won't try and show you all these data and so forth. But in general, the idea is that people create embodied simulations of what it must be like when we understand language. And this process of simulation occurs even when you're using metaphoric language as abstract, or refers to actions that are physically impossible to perform. You physically can't grasp a concept, but metaphorically, in an embodied way, you can. This is why you're able to project yourself into situations sometimes that you've never experienced yourself, but you can still run the kinds of simulations. This is another different kinds of studies. We have these metaphors for time. Everybody point to the future. Can you point to where your future is? Yeah, so you're all pointing in front. Oh, this is so it's all around us. But most of you, in Western cultures, you point forward. The past is behind you. Right? This is a study where we had people talk about, I didn't do this, but some people had people talk about the future, talk about the past, and they did it as they were standing in a particular spot. And what they measured was, how did they lean when they talk? And it turns out when people speak about the future, they lean, using metaphors. When they talk about the past, they lean backwards. So it's like you're embodying this thing as you're speaking and thinking. It has this effect upon your body in particular ways. All right. Let me skip this. This is really interesting about how certain kinds of embodied metaphors can help you become more creative. So that, in other words, if you had a person, ever heard it's like, think outside the box, be creative. Well, there's experiments that if you actually put people in a box and then have them solve some problems, they're not as good as the people who sit outside the box. If you have people asked to follow a diagram on the floor that's like a rectangle, and then you give them some problems to solve, they're not as good at it as if you tell people just to walk around freely on their own. So there's something about creativity and our ability to solve problems, which again is tied to certain kinds of bodily kinds of metaphors, influenced by how we're thinking metaphorically with the body, that has an influence upon some of our creative problem-solving abilities. But I do want to say a little bit about some of these other experiments, because these are kind of really cute. Consider the expressions, affection is warm, which is a metaphor such as, he was greeted warmly by his family, or she was given the cold shoulder at the party. So we think of things that are affectionate as physical warmth. And this is something that we experience with our bodies all the time. Here's the study that shows that we do this automatically, even without language being present. A subject comes for an experiment, and the experimenter meets the participant on the ground floor. They get into an elevator to ride up to the 4th floor, and the experimenter hands the person a warm cup of coffee or a cold cup of coffee. Thank you very much. They ride up to the 4th floor, they go into the experimental room. Thank you, takes the coffee away, you sit down. And they give them a sheet of paper where they describe a fictitious person. And they read about the person. And then they have to make judgments of what they think about the person. The people who hold the warm cup of coffee first rate that person as being more affectionate than if they hold the cold cup of coffee. They're not aware of doing this. But in a sense, what they're doing is by holding the cup of coffee that's warm, it actually almost primes or prompts the sense of affection, since they're so deeply related in our experience. It has an effect upon the social judgments we make about others. Here's another one. God is up, devil is down. So we had these expressions of glory to God in the highest, looking up at the Lord. The devil is down, devil lives down in hell. Here's the experiment. You're presented with a picture of a person's face, a bunch of them. And you simply have to make a judgment. Does this person believe in God? No? Oh, you know why you're saying that?
Because it looks like a mugshot.
Yeah, they're all like this. You know why you're saying he doesn't believe in God? Because the picture is presented down on the screen. When the pictures are presented higher up on the screen, they think it's more likely the person to believe in God. If you ask the other opposite judgment, does this person believe in the devil? Oh yeah, look at the devil. But it has to be at the downward portion of the screen. So where we see making these judgments, we think of God, we think of up. We think of devil, we think of down. And so when we encounter things spatially in the world like that, it influences how we perceive and judge it because we're automatically engaged in this kind of embodied metaphorical reasoning. Oh, this is a good one. I love this one. Morality is cleanliness or immorality is dirt. So you say Barry has a clean conscience and Ray has a dirty mind. Here's the experiment. You bring people into a laboratory and you go, I want you to sit down and write about a time you committed an ethical act. Or another group of people, I want you to write about a time that you did something unethical. And you write about what you did unethical. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being an experiment. For being in the experiment, you have a little prize. You can either pick a group of pencils or these antiseptic can wipes. The people who write about the time that they committed an ethical act, no difference. Half of them pick the pencils, half of them pick the wipes. The people who write about the unethical act, the vast majority pick the hand wipes. You know why? Because they've done something dirty and they want to clean it up. They want to become free of the dirt. This is an automatic metaphorical thing that affects how we make judgments. It's part of our bodily experiences. There's a relationship to why things that are ethical and things that are moral are thought to be clean and things that are unethical and immoral are thought to be dirty. It's something we experience in the world with our bodies. And it affects how we use and understand language, to give you the examples I showed, and how we make these judgments. And then finally, I have one here. Personal substances weight. She had a heavy influence in the debate. He's an intellectual lightweight. Right? So here's a study where you bring people into the lab and you give them a story about a person. You give them a story that's on a clipboard. And they have to read the story and they have to make judgments about the person, whether or not they think it's important, serious. If the clipboard is light, and it feels light in their hands, they don't rate the person as important than if it's a heavy clipboard. The weightiness of the heavy clipboard influences us in terms of making the judgments about the person. By the way, in terms of, I've done this also in terms of jury decision making. You have to make a decision, guilty or innocent. You sit on a hard bench, guilty. Put a cushion on you, nah, not so much. These are bodily effects about hardness, felt sensations in our experience that we use in making judgments all the time in our life. We're not even aware of this, but these are influences from our body and the world, interactions with the world that shape how we think. Emotion. Quickly about emotion. Let me just tell you, there are these metaphors. Burning with love for Harry. She swept me off my feet as if the love is a physical force working against us. Peter is depressed. He sees by fear as if it's an animal. Madly in love. You're in love? What does it mean to be in love? To be in love means you're walking down, life is good, and next thing you fall into this pit. The love pit, and you go, how did I get here? Until you're eventually dumped, and then you get out of the love pit. It's a metaphor. You don't think it's metaphorical, but it's inherently metaphorical. Anger, Peter Lewis, Stack, and Steve. So these things are very much embodied metaphors, which is how our emotion system works in many ways. But here's, quiz. What does pissing have to do with being angry? What does pissing have to do with anger? Yes?
When you're angry, you're likely to release emotions. When you're pissing, you're releasing.
Exactly. In a way, exactly. If you think of anger as being heated fluid in the container, so when you get too much anger, your fluid builds up. Next thing you know, you blow your stack, you flip your lid, your blood boils, stuff comes out, including like, look, you're pissing me off. I'm pissing, I don't want to piss, it's uncontrollable, I'm angry. That's why that means what it does. You now know, you've learned something tonight. Yes?
Can you give us like a similar reason why like clean would be moral and dirty would be immoral? Like you're talking about how our physical, like our blood warming and stuff makes us think that. Like what about our physical experiences makes us think moral is clean?
Because, things that are clean are associated with health. things that are dirty are associated with illness and death. In fact, you find the same experiments where you have people sit in a lab and it's messy and full of stuff. They'll read a paper about a person and rate that person as being less ethical, just simply because of the presence of a physical mess. So again, we think of cleanliness as being close to godliness, being to health and survival. Things that are dirty are things you don't want in your food, things that are bad for your health. And that's where that correlation in our experience comes from. Yes, sir?
So you know how a lot of these movements say you learn how to view the world based on what you do, but when it comes to emotion, it's very specific to parts of your face, like in studies where they inject Botox and they can only feel emotions and paralyze their face.
Yep.
No way.
Yeah.
Yes. So people who have a Botox injection are slower at being able to understand sentences having to do with anger. Because they can't do the anger, they can't simulate, they can't do it. It's a good study, it's actually but you're right. Let me just say that anger is not, emotion is not just in your face, it's within your entire body. Let me give you this one other thing here. This is, so in general, people experience motions as felt movement here. This is a person in an experiment where they put this pencil in your mouth. And then you read a story about a person, read this story, and then rate how funny it is. They rate it much funnier when they have a pencil in their mouth like this than if I'm not going to actually stick your lid. Like, see, you're frowning. Here, you're kind of almost like smiling a little. Simply putting your body into the posture relevant to some emotion will drive you towards thinking that. You'll think more positively when you're forced to smile. This is a thing my teachers used to tell me when I was a kid. Just smile, sit up straight, you'll be better. I was like, fuck you, I'm not going to do that. Unfortunately, they're correct. They're absolutely correct. Smile. If you want to be happier, smile. If you want to be happier and less depressed, sit up. It's true. These bodily things, our emotions are very much touched through our bodily things. All right, I'm coming to the end here, actually. So I'm going to say just a few words about consciousness, since this is about consciousness. And there's a lot I can say here, but here's the idea. Consciousness, of course, is a complex thing. It has many levels. It's multi-level, multifaceted. But at least in two things, I think embodied simulations in particular are relevant. When I think about my in-the-moment conscious experience, just like what's happening in the here and now, again, very much of it is tied to the anticipated bodily movements I can do into the world. Like, what can I do to this camp? I'm running simulations of an embodied sort. So that sense of what's happening now to me is partly influenced and structured by embodied simulations. When I think about the future, and I go, gee, after this talk today, I think I'm going to go over to Social Science 2 and jump off the roof of the building. What would that be like? And so I think I can run a simulation about what my future would be like if I did that, what it would be like, what that would be like. And the beauty of embodied simulations, it tells you when it might not be a good idea to do those things. So by running the simulation of, what would it be like if I did X, you can sometimes realize maybe I shouldn't do X, or maybe I should do X. So embodied simulation is an important part of our meta-awareness of what our future actions will be. Embodied simulations are, again, an important part of consciousness. Things like thought experiments in philosophy, thought experiments that people in science do. Einstein thought about what would be like for him to ride a light beam. That was a very important part of his thinking about his special theory of relativity. He did his thought experiment. The thought experiment wasn't just an abstraction, it's an embodied simulation. So certain aspects, or significant aspects of embodiment, are tied to our different aspects of consciousness. All right, so let me conclude here simply by saying that embodied action, as I make this argument here, it doesn't necessarily explain everything. But at least compared to the traditional view that many of us have been living with, and I dare say many of you are being taught, even here at UCSC, embodied action is central to all parts of perception, thinking, language use, aspects of emotions and consciousness. And in this way, the kind of classic dualism between the mind and body is, I think, an error. There is no split. The mind is inherently embodied in a very significant kind of way. Embodied simulations, I'm going to argue more specifically, are a central part of our experiences, in which we imaginatively project ourselves into linguistic and non-linguistic actions, of simple things that we perceive into these big, higher level complex narratives that we hear or read. And that's an important hypothesis that I think a lot of people, including myself, are working on these days. Methodologically, here's the thing, the lesson I want you to come away from with this today. If you are interested in anything about how humans work, you've got to study the body. You can't a priori go, well, this is some phenomena that doesn't include the body, so therefore I didn't have to consider it. That's empirically been shown to be completely wrong. And over and over and over again. And the more that we study things, almost any topic, almost any aspect of human experience, bodily things are becoming more and more relevant. And so you can't dismiss a priori the embodied hypothesis. You have to at least empirically look for it. And if you don't find it, then fine. You can place some limits on it. But you can't dismiss it a priori out of hand. Okay, finally, here's a quiz. All right? Imagine a romantic relationship. Suppose you're in a romantic relationship. And one of you says, when asked about how's the relationship, one of you says, we're building a strong foundation for the future of our relationship. They're using a particular embodied metaphor here. The relationships are kind of these manufactured objects that we build. But you ask the other of you, the other partner, what's the relationship like? And they say, our relationship is moving along in a good direction. Our relationships in this case are being conceived of as a kind of journey. So the two people in the same relationship, they're both positive, they think the relationship is good. My question is the following. Does the fact that they use different metaphors mean that they're thinking cognitively about the relationship in different ways? Yes. Second, does the fact that they use different metaphors suggest that they love each other differently?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
let's hear it. Tell me what you tell me what you're shaking your head, you were saying yes, you think they do love each other differently?
I mean, okay, so with the journey, I think of a journey as not necessarily having an end point.
Yes.
But the manufactured object, usually once you've manufactured something, there is a completion
Yes.
to it.
Yes. Excuse me. One of my ex-wives and I had a discussion where she was talking, I reason I use this, like we're building this thing and it's like, and then she was talking about, see, we're going to get married, this is before we're going to get married, and we'll have kids, and then we'll go for and then we'll be dead. And she was like planning us to be dead in this place. And I was thinking, no, we'll move along and change, and things will be different, it'll be crazy. It's very different senses of what the relationship is. And I think it really did happen. I don't mean to be oversimplistic about my complexities of my life, but I think it does give you a different sense of how you're thinking about your love relationship. And it actually has an influence about the nature of the love. You may love each other the same amount, but you can still love each other differently, precisely because you embrace different kinds of embodied metaphors.
And the object, too, can be broken apart.
Yes.
Whereas a journey, you can get lost.
Yes.
But
But you can
it's
also pick things up and set them aside and go off in different directions. There's more flexibility and freedom. Yes.
I want to play devil's advocate
Please.
for a minute. So, what would you say to someone who says, this is all great, accept all of it, the body has something to say about how we think, etc. But first of all, it's not the whole story. Secondly, what do you do about cases like you mentioned in court, like cases where there's a lot of like normative import? What do you do in those cases? Do we then, is there like a meta level? You also mentioned meta reflection. Is there like a meta level where we might say, man, I have a lot of unconscious bias, and here I have to try to abstract away from what my body may be telling me, like it's totally arbitrary. I think this person is nicer because she handed me, a hot cup of coffee or whatever.
Yes.
And might there be mechanisms in that? So your research might actually shed light on like how court proceedings, etc., should be done, because now we have to start thinking, wow, it's just so pervasive.
Right.
How we make all these arbitrary.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I may ask you to say a bit more about what you suggested, but your comments, I think, is something I obviously have heard before, and it's a tough one. But my point, I think, in part in response is to argue that some of those things, those more sort of meta-normative kinds of things, those themselves will still often be found to be full of embodied metaphors. You know, and this is one of the things about the world of metaphor studies. We've gone into every academic discipline. Name a field. they've shown here are the embodied metaphors that structure the way academics and scientists and whatever are working and doing their thing. Mathematics, the most complex forms of mathematics, so says certain people, George Lakoff amongst one of them, is actually structured in terms of embodied metaphor, fundamentally. We may think it's this kind of transcendental, idealist, platonic thing of the mind that's abstract from the body, but in fact, if you look at the way that they speak and write about in their disciplines and they're doing their work theoretically, it's still full of these kinds of embodied metaphors. So my question would be, is there a level at which, okay, we don't need the body anymore? Is that really true?
I mean, I think it's always there. I mean, this is obviously an empirical question, but I also think it's a framing question.
Yeah.
It's also a question about how do you want to frame the question in the first
Sure.
place.
And I think partly, and I think that's a great point, and I think part of our trying to reframe the question is what minds are all about. I mean, I grew up, when you wanted to study cognition, you made the body still. You wanted to get rid of the body so you get to the pure essence of what cognition is. Because we thought it was just like a little computer in the mind. But by doing that, you automatically get away from the thing that maybe is partly influenced by how people actually think and use language. And so it's a reframing of how we think about the nature of what minds are like. And again, I think, I've written things and books about this kind of stuff, to suggest that wherever you look at the human experience, from the highest levels of aspects of consciousness down to the most primitive levels of perception, sensory motor functioning, it's very much all tied to kind of recurring aspects of the body experience. Not all of it, but it has a significant role in whatever theory ultimately comes. I don't mean to run over here. We're 5 minutes over. We're 5 minutes. Let's stop. Thank you.